The fluorescent lights of St. Jude's Medical Center hummed with a sterile, flickering persistence that always gave Sarah Jenkins a mild headache. By 3 a.m. outside, a relentless Chicago thunderstorm battered the reinforced glass of the emergency room doors. Inside, the chaos was a dull, manageable roar. A pair of drunken college students were arguing in Bay 4. An elderly woman with pneumonia wheezed softly in Bay 2, and Dr. Arthur Pendleton was complaining about the hospital's dreadful coffee at the central charting station. For Sarah, it was painfully mundane. Just 3 years ago. Her night shifts had consisted of hovering 200 feet above the Hindu Kush in a modified MH-60 Blackhawk, the distinct smell of aviation fuel and copper blood filling her nostrils. As a flight medic attached to the U.S. Army's elite 161st Special Operations Aviation Regiment and frequently loaned two deeply classified JSOC units, Sarah had seen the human body torn apart in ways medical textbooks rarely dared to illustrate. She had packed catastrophic wounds under heavy machine gun fire in Fallujah and performed emergency cricothyrotomies in the pitch-black back of a Humvee in Roxa. Compared to that, adjusting an IV drip for a dehydrated stockbroker was like finger painting. Earth to Jenkins. Maggie, the veteran charge nurse, snapped her fingers in front of Sarah's face. "You're staring a hole through that monitor. Go, take your break. If one more person complains about waiting for a bed, I'm going to sedate them myself." Sarah blinked, the memory of rotor wash fading from her mind. "I'm good, Maggie. Just mapping out the shift." "You never sleep, I swear," Maggie muttered, turning back to the triage desk. The double doors of the ambulance bay didn't just open. They shattered inward. The heavy glass spider-web then gave way as a dark SUV slammed its front bumper directly into the concrete bollards. Outside the entrance, the impact shook the foundation of the waiting room. Dr. Pendleton dropped his coffee mug. It shattered on the linoleum, a sharp crack immediately overshadowed by the deafening roar of a short AR-15 firing a burst into the ceiling. Everybody on the ground, faces on the floor. Now, the man who kicked his way through the remaining glass was soaked in rainwater and blood. He was broad-shouldered, wearing a dark tactical vest over a heavy winter coat, a black ski mask pushed halfway up his forehead. He gripped the rifle with white-knuckled intensity. Behind him, he dragged a second man by the collar of his jacket, a man leaving a thick, viscous trail of arterial red across the pristine white floor tiles. David Miller, the hospital's 60-year-old security guard, made a fatal mistake. He reached for his hip radio. The gunman didn't hesitate. He pivoted and fired twice. Pop. Pop. Miller was thrown backward, collapsing against the vending machines in a spray of red. Screams erupted. Patients dove under plastic waiting chairs. Maggie froze, her hands clamped over her mouth. Dr. Pendleton scrambled beneath a charting desk, his knees trembling violently. Sarah didn't scream. She didn't dive. She dropped into a low, controlled crouch behind a rolling crash cart. Her heart rate, which should have spiked to a panicked 150 beats per minute, settled into a steady, rhythmic 80. The civilian world vanished. The sterile, melted away. She was back in the combat zone. "Who's a doctor?" The gunman roared, dragging his bleeding companion toward the center of the trauma bay. He hoisted the dying man onto a gurney with a grunt of exertion. "I said who is a doctor. Fix him, or I start putting holes in everybody's heads." The bleeding man, younger, maybe early 20s, was gasping, his skin a horrific, translucent gray. A gunshot wound to the upper right thigh had severed the femoral artery. Without immediate, aggressive intervention, he had less than 3 minutes to live. Dr. Pendleton, pale and weeping, slowly raised his hand from beneath the desk. I am. Please, don't shoot. Get over here." The gunman grabbed Pendleton by his lab coat, hauling the terrified physician to his feet and shoving him toward the gurney. "My brother got hit. The cops ambushed us down on 5th. Fix him." Pendleton looked at the geyser of blood pulsing from the leg. His hands were shaking so badly he couldn't even snap on a pair of latex gloves. I need a trauma team. This is an arterial bleed. I need a surgeon. Primera. Need. You do it." The gunman pressed the searing hot barrel of the AR-15 against Pendleton's temple. The smell of burnt gunpowder and singed hair filled the air. "Do it or die right here, Doc." Sarah watched from behind the crash cart. She analyzed the gunman. Dominic. She heard the dying brother wheeze. Dominic's stance was wide but sloppy. He had high-end gear, level 3, armor plates, a customized rifle with a holographic sight. But his trigger discipline was non-existent. He was a thug who had bought expensive toys, not a trained operator, and Pendleton was going to get them all killed. The doctor was in a full sympathetic nervous system crash. He couldn't even speak, let alone clamp an artery. Sarah stood up. She kicked the brake off the crash cart and calmly pushed it out into the open, moving directly into the gunman's line of sight. "He can't fix him," Sarah said, her voice eerily calm, cutting through the hysterical sobbing of the waiting room. "He's an attending physician who hasn't seen a gunshot wound since his residency. Your brother has a severed femoral artery. In 2 minutes, his heart is going to run out of blood to pump, and he's going to die on this table." Dominic swung the rifle toward her. The laser sight painted a bright red dot directly on the center of her chest. "Shut your mouth. Get on the floor. Shoot me, and your brother dies." Sarah didn't stop walking. She pushed the cart right up to the gurney, stepping between the trembling doctor and the furious gunman. She looked down at the brother, then snapped a pair of gloves onto her hands. "I'm a trauma nurse. I can stop the bleeding, but you need to step back and let me work." Dominic laughed, a harsh, manic sound. "A nurse? You're a bedpan pusher, honey. You think you're going to save Leo?" "I think I'm the only one in this room whose hands aren't shaking," Sarah replied coldly. She grabbed a pair of trauma shears and ripped the brother's pant leg open in one violent, practiced motion. Dominic stared at her, caught off guard by the sheer absence of fear in her eyes. He lowered the rifle an inch. "If he dies, I'm taking you with him." Sarah didn't look up. Not it. The ER was suffocatingly quiet, broken only by the ragged, wet breathing of Leo Reed and the distant wailing of Chicago PD sirens converging on the hospital. Dominic paced like a caged tiger. He had locked the main doors, dragging heavy waiting room chairs against the shattered glass entrance. He periodically aimed his rifle at the huddled patients in the corner, threatening them whenever a child whimpered or a phone buzzed. At the central gurney, Sarah went to work. It was a chaotic, bloody mess, but her movements were a terrifyingly precise choreography. The civilian approach would be to apply pressure, call for a vascular surgeon, and prep an OR. There was no OR tonight. "Hold this!" Sarah commanded, shoving a stack of gauze into Dr. Pendleton's trembling hands and pressing them hard into the wound. "Push down!" "Use your body weight, Arthur. If you let up, he bleeds out." "I can't. The blood. It's so slick." Sarah ignored him. She ripped open a sealed package of Quick-Clot, combat gauze, and jammed her fingers directly into the torn flesh of Leo's thigh, finding the severed artery by feel alone. Dominic gagged, stepping back. "What the hell are you doing to him?" "Saving his life." Her tone carried the absolute, unquestionable authority of an officer commanding a subordinate. Dominic actually flinched into silence. She packed the gauze deep into the wound cavity, packing it so tightly that the hemostatic agents could chemically accelerate clotting. It was agonizingly painful. Leo, who had been drifting into unconsciousness, suddenly shrieked. His back arched off the table, his eyes snapping open. "Get off him!" Dominic roared, raising the rifle again. "Hold him down!" Sarah yelled at Pendleton. She pulled the CAT combat tourniquet from her cargo pocket, a habit she had never broken since, leaving the military, looped it high and tight around Leo's thigh, and cranked the windlass rod with brutal efficiency. Click, 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 click. The geyser of blood slowed, then stopped. Sarah exhaled a slow, controlled breath. "He's stabilized for now, but he needs a massive transfusion. He's lost at least 3 liters. Dominic stepped closer, his boots leaving bloody footprints on the tiles. He looked from his pale, gasping brother to Sarah, A cruel smile spread across his face beneath the ski mask. Well. Look at Florence Nightingale, he sneered, using the barrel of the AR-15 to tap the ID badge on her scrubs. Sarah Jenkins. You got a lot of nerve, sweetheart. Must watch a lot of medical shows. Something like that, Sarah said softly. But her eyes were scanning, categorizing. Dominant right hand. Sling is improperly mounted. If he drops the weapon, it will tangle. He's running a 30-round magazine. Fired 2 at the guard, 3 into the ceiling. 25 rounds remaining. Sidearm on his right hip. Glock 19. Retention holster strap unbuttoned. He's arrogant. He thinks he's the apex predator in the room. The cops are outside, Dr. Pendleton whispered. His eyes wide as flashing red and blue lights began painting the rainy windows. Domek spun toward the glass. Outside, a perimeter was rapidly forming, cruisers blocking the streets, heavily armored SWAT officers taking position behind engine blocks. Damn it. He kicked a metal trash can, sending it flying across the room.
Nobody gets in. Nobody gets out. If they breach those doors, I execute everybody in here, starting with the doctor. They won't breach immediately, Sarah said, adjusting the foredrip. What makes you the expert nurse? Standard hostage protocol. They'll try to establish communications first. They want to know how many hostages are inside, the condition of the wounded, and your demands. Dominic marched up to her, invading her space. He stood a full head taller, his chest heaving, smelling of sweat and gunpowder. You think you're smart. You're not smart. You're trapped in a cage with a wolf. And when Leo is good to move, I'm taking you with us as a shield. Sarah looked up at him. Her expression was completely devoid of emotion, the same look she had given an insurgent in Kandahar just before she buried a combat knife in his carotid artery. He's not going anywhere, Sarah said flatly. He needs surgery. If you move him, the clot blows and he dies in the back of your car. Then I guess you're coming with us to keep him alive. Dominic grabbed a handful of her scrub top, yanking her forward. I like you. You got ice in your veins. But don't forget who holds the gun. You hold a gun, Sarah thought, her eyes locked onto his. I am the weapon. The phone at the triage desk began to ring. Answer it, Dominic ordered Pendleton. Tell them if they cut the power, I start shooting. Tell them I want a helicopter on the roof in 20 minutes. As Pendleton stumbled toward the phone, Sarah moved back to the crash cart. Her hands brushed over the rows of medical supplies, syringes, epinephrine, potassium chloride, defibrillator paddles. To a civilian, it was life-saving equipment. To a Tier 1 combat medic, trained by the world's most lethal special operations units, it was an arsenal. Pendleton picked up the receiver with a shaking hand. Hello, yes, he's here. He wants a helicopter on the roof. Dominic snatched the phone and hit speaker. Listen to me. You have 20 minutes to get a chopper on that roof, or I paint the walls with these people. A calm voice answered. Dominic, this is Captain Harris with the CPD Crisis Negotiation Team. We know about the armored car. We know things went wrong. We just want to make sure everyone inside is safe, especially your brother Leo. Dominic's jaw tightened. How do you know my name? We ran the plates on the SUV. It's over, Dominic. There's nowhere to go. Let the medical staff and patients walk out, and we can get Leo the surgical help he needs. Shut up. He slammed the phone down, shattering the casing. He spun toward the huddled hostages in the corner, leveling the rifle. Which one of you goes first? They think I'm playing. Sarah recognized the shift instantly. The adrenaline high was gone. What remained was paranoia, desperation, and the irrational, cornered animal need to prove he was serious. He was going to execute a hostage. Dominic. He didn't turn. He kept the rifle on Maggie, who was openly weeping. "Shut up, nurse. I'm done talking to you. Leo is seizing." Dominic whipped around. On the gurney, Leo was perfectly still, unconscious, but stable. But the monitor beside him, which Sarah had quietly reprogrammed during the phone call by adjusting the alarm thresholds, suddenly erupted in a shrill, rapid warning alarm. Red lights flashed across the screen. "What's happening? What did you do to him? He's going into hypovolemic shock. His heart is fibrillating." Sarah moved with frantic, calculated purpose, grabbing the heavy Zal defibrillator paddles from the crash cart. "I need to shock him to reset his rhythm. Move." Dominic stepped back, his eyes glued to the flashing monitor, panicked for his brother, overwhelming his rage. "Do it. Save him." Charging to 200 joules, Sarah hit the charge button. The machine let out a rising electronic whine. Clear. She didn't place the paddles on Leo's chest. In one fluid, blindingly fast motion, Sarah pivoted on her heel and closed the 3 feet between herself and Dominic before his brain could process the movement. She slammed both conductive steel paddles directly into his neck and collarbone, just above the Kevlar vest. She pressed the discharge buttons. Crack. 200 joules of raw electricity surged directly into his nervous system. Dominic's entire body went rigid as a board. His jaw clamped shut with enough force to fracture his own molars. A guttural, choking sound escaped his throat. The muscles in both arms violently contracted. His finger jerked the trigger of the AR-15 in a final involuntary spasm. The burst of 5.56 mm rounds tore into the ceiling tiles, raining plaster and dust down on the trauma bay. Then his body went completely limp, dropping toward the floor like a sack of cement. Sarah didn't stop to admire her work. Before Dominic even hit the tiles, she caught the falling AR-15 by the barrel, twisted it violently out of his slackened grip, flipped the weapon over, checked the chamber, wrapped the sling around her forearm for stability, and brought the stock tight to her shoulder. She stood over the twitching body of the gunman, the rifle sweeping the room with military precision, clearing her sectors. Silence slammed back into the ER, broken only by the continuous ringing of the altered heart monitor. Dr. Pendleton was staring at her, jaw completely unhinged. Maggie had stopped crying and was looking at Sarah as though an alien had just unzipped a human disguise. Sarah clicked the rifle selector switch from burst to safe. "Arthur," she said. Her voice returned to that chilling baseline calm. "Silence that monitor. It's giving me a headache." "Why, yes. Yes, Sarah." Pendleton scrambled up from the floor and hit the mute button. Dominic groaned on the tiles, his eyes rolling back, saliva pooling at the corner of his mouth. He wasn't dead, but his central nervous system had been scrambled. He wouldn't be moving for a while. Sarah looked down at him, her expression hardening. "I told you I was the only one in this room whose hands weren't shaking." She reached down, unclipped Dominic's radio from his tactical vest, and keyed the microphone. "CPD command, this is St. Jude's Primary threat is neutralized. Secure your perimeter and send your medical teams in. We have a gunshot victim requiring immediate surgery." A long, stunned silence followed on the other end. "Copy that, St. Jude's. Who am I speaking with?" Sarah slung the rifle over her back and pulled a fresh pair of latex gloves from the wall dispenser. She snapped them onto her wrists with a sharp thwack. "Just a nurse," Sarah replied. "Hurry up. I have a break in 10 minutes." The deafening silence that followed the incapacitation of the gunman was finally broken by the screech of heavy tires on wet asphalt and the thunderous, organized shouting of the Chicago Police Department's SWAT team. Outside the shattered entrance of St. Jude's, red and blue strobes painted the rain-soaked pavement in frantic, pulsating rhythm. Sarah remained perfectly still, the captured AR-15 resting with practiced ease against her shoulder, muzzle pointed safely downward at a 45-degree angle, finger indexed rigidly along the outside of the trigger guard. "Arthur, get behind the triage counter," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maggie, keep your head down and cover your ears. They may use flashbangs if they don't see a clear path." "But you told them it was clear," Dr. Pendleton squeaked, scrambling on his hands and knees behind the reinforced fiberglass of the reception desk. "Tactical teams don't trust radios," Sarah replied, her gaze fixed on the spider-webbed doors. "They trust their eyes." She was entirely correct. Within seconds, the heavy barricaded chairs Dominic had shoved against the entrance were violently bulldozed aside. An armored Bearcat drove its steel bumper directly into the debris. Then came the entry team point man first, ballistic shield raised, suppressed submachine guns sweeping. 4 additional officers flooded the lobby behind him, weapon-mounted flashlights cutting through the dim, flickering fluorescent lighting. "Chicago PD, drop the weapon. Drop it now." The lead officer's weapon-mounted light blinded Sarah, washing out her vision in brilliant white luminescence. She didn't panic. She didn't make any sudden movements. Slowly, deliberately, she allowed the AR-15 to slide off her shoulder, letting the tactical sling catch the weight of the rifle, and raised both empty hands into the air, palms forward. "Threat is down on the floor to your left," Sarah called out, her tone remarkably steady. "The weapon is secured. I am a trauma nurse. I have wounded civilians in the corner and a critical patient on the gurney who requires immediate surgical intervention." Lieutenant James Harrison, commander of the SWAT detachment, stepped through the shattered glass, boots crunching loudly on the debris. He was a broad, imposing man with graying temples visible beneath his Kevlar helmet. He swept his tactical light slowly across the scene. He saw the terrified patients huddled behind the vending machines. He saw Dr. Pendleton shivering behind the desk. He saw Dominic, a heavily armored gunman, convulsing and drooling on the floor, 2 distinct, perfectly circular burn marks on his neck and collarbone. And then he saw Sarah, standing in blood-spattered blue scrubs, a high-tech assault rifle slung casually across her back like a messenger bag, hands raised in tranquil compliance. "Clear," shouted one of his operators, kicking Dominic's dropped handgun away from his twitching fingers. "Suspect is down and incapacitated." "Secure him," Harrison barked. He holstered his sidearm and walked slowly toward Sarah, eyes moving from the rifle to the expression on her face. An expression of complete, unnerving calm. "You're the nurse who keyed the radio." "Sarah Jenkins," she replied, slowly lowering her hands as the immediate tension began to evaporate. "Welcome to St. Jude's, Lieutenant. I apologize for the mess in the lobby." Harrison stared at her for a long, silent moment. "You took down a heavily armed active shooter with a defibrillator. He was distracted," Sarah said plainly, turning her attention back to the gurney. "And he made the mistake of stepping into my workspace." She paused, glancing back over her shoulder. "Now, if you don't mind, Lieutenant, I have a patient surviving on borrowed time and a combat tourniquet." As the hospital swarmed with police officers, federal agents, and arriving medical staff, The chaos transitioned from violent hostage situation to bureaucratic nightmare. The ER was locked down, wrapped in miles of bright yellow crime scene tape. Sarah efficiently organized the transfer of care. She refused to speak with detectives until every patient was stabilized and handed off properly. "You run a tight ship, Nurse Jenkins," Dr. Pendleton mumbled later, sipping lukewarm coffee in the hospital's break room. He looked significantly older than he had 3 hours ago. The color had completely drained from his face, and his hands still carried a faint tremor. "It's just protocol, Arthur," Sarah replied softly, washing dried rust-colored blood from her forearms in the break room sink. The warm water felt grounding, washing away the adrenaline that had carried her through the night. "No, Sarah." Pendleton shook his head slowly. "Protocol is calling a code and waiting for security. What you did out there, the way you moved, the way you handled that weapon, you didn't just survive that situation." He paused, searching for the right words. "You dominated it. Who exactly are you?" Sarah dried her hands on a paper towel, offering him a faint, enigmatic smile. "I told you, Arthur. I'm just a nurse who watches a lot of medical shows." She tossed the paper towel in the trash and walked out of the break room, leaving Dr. Pendleton to ponder the impossibility of her answer. She needed air. The sterile metallic scent of the hospital was suddenly suffocating her, pulling up memories she had spent 3 years trying to bury. Dawn broke over the Chicago skyline, casting long gray shadows across the rain-slicked streets. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a cold, biting wind that whipped through the city. St. Jude's was surrounded by a small army of news vans, satellite dishes extended toward the pale morning sky. Reporters jockeyed aggressively for position behind the police barricades. Sarah stood on the hospital's rooftop helipad, the wind tugging fiercely at her fleece jacket. The city below was waking up entirely oblivious to the violent drama that had unfolded within the medical center's walls just hours before. She closed her eyes, breathed in the frigid morning air. It grounded her. It reminded her she was in Illinois, not standing in the burning wreckage of a compound in the Middle East. "You always did prefer the high ground, didn't you, Jenkins?" The voice was deep, gravelly, and entirely unexpected. Sarah didn't flinch. She didn't spin around. She slowly opened her eyes and turned her head. Standing near the rooftop access door was a man in a sharply tailored charcoal suit beneath a dark wool overcoat. His face was weathered, lined with the stress of 1,000 classified secrets. His piercing blue eyes carried the focused weight of a predatory bird assessing its prey. "Agent Thomas Griffin," Sarah said, her voice betraying nothing. "I wondered how long it would take for the alphabet agencies to intercept the police reports. I didn't expect the CIA before breakfast." Griffin offered a humorless, thin smile. He walked slowly across the tar-papered roof, stopping a few feet from her. "The local police are confused. Sarah, they have a sworn statement from a very traumatized physician claiming a triage nurse disarmed a highly aggressive shooter with the tactical proficiency of a Tier 1 operator." He paused. "They ran your fingerprints." The database spat back a restricted file with the Department of Defense lock on it. "I have a sealed record," Sarah said coldly, returning her gaze to the skyline. "My time in the 161st SOAR is classified. My work with JSOC is classified. I am a private citizen now, Griffin. I pull night shifts, tape up sprained ankles, and pay my taxes. I don't work for you anymore. You never truly stop working for us, Sarah." Griffin stepped closer to the edge of the roof. He looked down at the flashing police lights below. Dominic Reed wasn't a random thug. He and his brother were hired contractors. They hit a Department of Energy transport vehicle on Fifth Avenue. Sarah frowned, her professional instincts momentarily overriding her desire to be left alone. A dough transport. What were they stealing? Something deeply unpleasant, Griffin said quietly. A highly encrypted drive containing operational schematics for domestic power grid infrastructure. We've been tracking the buyer for 6 months. The Reed brothers got greedy, the handoff went south, and they shot their way out. Leo caught a bullet in the femoral during the escape, so they panicked and hit the nearest us, Sarah concluded, shaking her head. They were desperate, Griffin corrected, and they would have killed everyone in that room to secure an escape route. He paused. You saved a dozen lives tonight, Sarah, and you secured a prime suspect, who can lead us to the buyer. I did my job as a nurse, Sarah said stubbornly, crossing her arms. I saved my patients, that's all. Griffin reached into his overcoat and produced a thick, unmarked manila envelope. He held it out against the wind. Your skills are rusting in this hospital, he said, his tone softening just a fraction. You are an apex predator, forcing yourself to live in a cage. We're putting together a deep cover task force. No uniforms, no restrictive rules of engagement. Surgical strikes against high-value targets. Sarah looked at the envelope. She knew exactly what was inside. Plane tickets, a new passport, a classified briefing document, a one-way ticket back into the shadows. She felt the familiar, dangerous pull, the intoxicating rush of the combat zone calling her name. And then she thought about the terrified look on Maggie's face. She thought about the way Pendleton had trembled. She thought about the absolute powerlessness of every civilian she had stood between and death tonight. I spent 6 years pulling broken soldiers out of the dirt, Sarah whispered, her eyes still on the envelope. I watched good people bleed to death in the dark because the helicopters couldn't reach us in time. She exhaled slowly. I came here to heal people in the light. I came here to have a normal life. Normal is an illusion for people like us, Sarah, Griffin said softly. You proved that tonight. You didn't hide. You didn't cower. When the wolf came to the door, you didn't call for help. He let the words hang in the cold morning air. You became the bigger wolf. Sarah slowly reached out. Griffin's eyes gleamed with anticipated victory. But Sarah didn't take the envelope. Instead, she reached past it and gently adjusted the collar of his expensive overcoat. You're right, Thomas, she said, stepping back and meeting his gaze directly. I am the bigger wolf. She held his eyes for a long moment. But this hospital is my territory now. These people are my pack. And I'm not leaving them defenseless. Griffin stood very still in the cold morning air. Then, slowly, a look of genuine respect washed across his weathered features. He lowered his hand, tucking the classified file back into his coat pocket. If you ever change your mind, he said, his voice dropping to a low rumble, you know how to reach the network. I won't, Sarah replied simply. Griffin nodded once, sharp, a precise military acknowledgement. He turned and walked back toward the rooftop access door, his dark silhouette blending into the shadows of the stairwell, before disappearing entirely. Sarah stood alone on the roof for a long time. She watched the sun finally break through the heavy Chicago clouds. The golden morning light washed over the city, warming her chilled skin. She took one last deep breath of the freezing air, centering herself, locking away the memories of Black Hawk helicopters and desert sand. Then she turned and headed back downstairs. The adrenaline was gone, replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. She had a mountain of paperwork to file, police statements to write, and an incredibly angry hospital administrator to face regarding the shattered front doors. As she walked back into the bright, chaotic emergency room, Maggie looked up from the triage desk. The older nurse's eyes were still red from crying, but she managed a weak, grateful smile. "Hey, Jenkins," Maggie called out softly. "Dr. Pendleton is looking for you. He says he needs help with a tricky four-stick in Bay 3. Sarah smiled back, a genuine warm expression that reached her eyes. She grabbed a fresh pair of latex gloves from the dispenser and snapped them onto her wrists with a sharp, familiar rhythm. "Tell him I'll be right there, Maggie," Sarah said, walking calmly back into the fray. "I'm just a nurse, after all."